Good morning. I'm Glenn Lowry, Director of the Museum of Modern Art, and delighted to welcome you to this conversation with two terrific curators whose exhibitions open simultaneously. How Should We Live? Propositions for the Modern Interior, which is made possible by Hyundai Card. It's curated by the wonderful Juliet Kinchin, in the Department of Architecture and Design. And Insecurities, Tracing Displacement and Shelter, is supported by the International Council and curated by Sean Anderson, also in the Department of Architecture and Design.
So we're taking over the museum.
Quite clearly you're taking over the museum. I was never in any doubt of that. There's something intriguing always about exhibition programs because in the end there's some kind of divine logic to them, but in their construction they're often the result of a series of utterly independent decisions. So I'd like to say that these two exhibitions are the result of long planning and deep research on our part, but they're not. And yet, no two exhibitions could, in a way, be better paired in terms of the way in which they address different aspects of home, housing, furnishing, the way we live. So I want to start, Sean, with you, and to talk a little bit about the thinking behind Insecurities, and then what you see as the principal issues it foregrounds.
Thank you, Glenn. This exhibition begins with a line, as it were, a line in which geographies are defined, imposed, and as a result, those geographies, by definition, through borders, through boundaries, then result in a kind of the construction of shelter, or the need for shelter. And given the emergency, the refugee, current and past and future refugee emergencies that are happening throughout the world, these borders and boundaries seem to be being built everywhere. And as a result, shelter is both noun and verb. On one hand, governments, nations, organizations are imposing in some way shelter onto large populations of people. And on the other hand, we have large populations of people carrying shelter with them, as it were, and designing, if you will, or building shelter as a requirement. And so for me, the exhibition represents this conundrum between the design or the imposition of design onto people versus the design of shelter from within that we carry with us.
That's a great lead-in to Modern Interiors, which also explores the question of space and how we populate space. And Juliet, do you want to give us the arc of Modern Interiors and talk a little bit, if you would, for a moment about what I think of as certainly an experiment for us, which is the introduction of a cafe, an actual functioning cafe, which I intend to use quite often.
Well, we take our starting point with the subtitle of an exhibition that took place in 1927, and that was How Should We Live? Wie wohnen? An exhibition in Stuttgart. And I think it focuses on what was the burning question of the day. It wasn't how should things, what should things look like? It was questioning the very fundaments of how we organize our lives, how we think about modern life, and how architects and designers responded to that in a period of, huge disruption, mass migration, processing the traumatic legacies of 2 world wars. So the exhibition is actually looking at 3 decades of questioning and thinking about how we should live more simply, more economically, more flexibly, in a period of momentous change, and how we make accessible to the widest possible constituency many of the innovations, technological and new materials and processes. But one of the things that impresses me so much about many of the architects and designers featured in the exhibition is just how much is the product of intense, deep thinking, which doesn't necessarily cost a fortune, and how in some ways there's the same need to address pressing problems with people destitute, homeless, starving on the streets of a city like Frankfurt in the late 20s. And without any obvious income stream, for example, there was a political will, there's manufacturers, architects, designers, politicians coming together to address not just the immediate expediency of the issue, but trying to think longer term how we shape, how we could live differently, how we could shape the future. And it might seem a real contrast to be introducing an evocation of Lily Reich's amazing Velvet Silk Cafe of 1927. But I think it took such courage to be staging such an innovative exhibition as part of a women's fashion exhibition in Berlin, which was all about trying to rebuild the economy and just open up people's imagination to interiors without walls. You're surrounded by these waving walls of fabric that define the space, and this bold use of color. I mean, for years I've been looking at these black and white photographs of the 1927 cafe, and to see it actually come alive with this rich textural palette and color, I hope people will really enjoy. Of course, it's giving us a lot of problems, potential problems, trying to accommodate that within the scope of the exhibition. But we really wanted, rather like allowing access to walk into the shelter in Sean's exhibition, we wanted to give people a sense of the immersive experience, the embodied experience of sitting for the first time. This was the first time people were able to sit on these cantilevered tubular steel chairs, which we have in reproduction form, and you can feel the springiness of those chairs, just as many people who were extremely dubious about sitting on a chair with no legs must have felt in 1927.
Thanks, Juliet. Sean, the centerpiece of Insecurities is an object that one wouldn't normally associate either with the Museum of Modern Art and especially with our collection, and that is a tent by IKEA. Do you want to locate the tent for us, both within the space of the exhibition, but much more importantly in terms of the issues it addresses specifically?
Right. Again, I would say that by introducing the shelter, I'm not going to use the word tent because it has a kind of dubious definition, as it were, but to introduce the shelter as both a counterpoint to and a center point for the exhibition was deliberate, because I think in one way, like Juliet says, to inhabit an interior that is so fragile that the architecture of the IKEA Foundation, Better Shelter, UNHCR collaboration is one in which the architecture and it is a litmus of both the dangers of the populations that are being forced to occupy shelters like that or itself. And on the other hand, that shelter and interiors are fragile in and of themselves. And so to occupy that space is at once to implicate the viewer in the conditions that are being deployed on the walls and on the floor. And at the same time to ask the question, is this an answer? Is this a solution on one hand? And then the kind of counterpoint to that is there a solution? And I think in a way that what resonates with the Velvet Silk Cafe is that precarity that someone might have by sitting on a beautiful cantilevered chair could possibly be felt in a similar way as the precarity of occupying a space that was wholly new and wholly, in a sense, developed for a person or an individual or a family. But I would argue that having spent now a significant amount of time in camps in Jordan in particular, where the imposition of a shelter, generally a metal shelter with a metal roof in 120-degree heat, is not necessarily a useful tool, a useful response, or even a helpful response. And in fact, I had a great conversation with a gentleman. He said, I refuse to live in these metal shelters. Now, the shelter that's in the exhibition is a lightweight PVC that was developed specifically for IKEA Foundation. And so the design of it is very much about mobility, easy logistics, transportability across multiple contexts. In the case of the camps, what we see, in fact, in this image, are corrugated metal tin boxes. And people are forced to then occupy these spaces, and without a choice, necessarily. And in Jordan, to go back to this story, it was that I sat for a long period of time with a gentleman who said, I am a Bedouin. I build tents. I will live in a tent. I will not live in a metal box. And I felt that choice, that moment in which an individual can make shelter, is a far more evocative sense of power and of ownership and identity than, say, something like that might incur.
The issues are deep. I use tent intentionally because I think the problem that is underscored by this investigation that you've done is that it's not just that there are 65 million refugees in the world at latest count. It's that they often live in camps that are now decades old. So the degree to which we call that a camp or a city is extremely complicated, and therefore the spaces in which they live either have a association of permanence to them or are intentionally temporary. And psychologically, I think for the people who are living there, the difference between, oh my God, this is where I will be living possibly forever, versus transition is critical. And one of the things that the exhibition does so well is to make graphic for us the experience of the many, many people who are living in these camps. I wonder, for instance, if you would relate the tapestry. That is, to me, one of the most moving objects there and how it came to be, and then connect it perhaps to Rena's wall drawing.
Well, I felt from the beginning that we could again think of geography as a space of violence in and of itself. So the line drawn in the sand is one in which we define us and them. And that architecture then is that in-between, say. And you're absolutely right, is the temporalities that are at play, both, I would say, in the interiors that you're showing, is in a sense, we are living in the time or of the time. And I feel that in camps, in these shelters, people are being robbed of time. And so the work by the National Union of Sahrawi Women, in collaboration with the Swiss architect Manuel Hertz, for me is an evocation of not only representing oneself or a civilization in and of itself, a community, but also speaks to a kind of utilitarianism of the rug that we step on, that we wipe our feet on, for instance. And so that work is part of a longstanding collaboration between Manuel Hertz and the community, the Rabuni camp, which is in southwestern Algeria. And that camp came into existence in the late 70s by virtue of the Western Sahara War. And the Sahrawis were forced out of Western Sahara. They took up shelter in this most remote corner of Algeria in the Sahara and have been there ever since. And over time, they have built their industry and their self-kind of proclaimed industry, their ministries, and so forth. And one of those industries is that women now have this trade in carpets, but they had to learn it, as it were. And they learned, and through Manuel drawing and working with me as well, we asked them to draw themselves, and draw themselves for the first time. And they drew themselves as a periphery and a center, which is occupied by the World Food Program, no less, a museum, which is a very small space, but it exists, where they document themselves, and a number of other ministries. So I felt an urgency to not only have this work in our collection, hopefully, but also in the exhibition, in which women are cultural producers and are very much in a design process and instrumental in representing the refugee nations, as it were, across the world. And to contrast that, for instance, with Rena's evocative work, is that here is a map that was painstakingly made by both herself and a team of preparators in the museum who were extraordinary, sewing and nailing every day. I would watch them. And in some way, I felt like, listening to their conversations as they were doing this, that they too were making themselves, representing themselves, and representing this institution within a larger, perhaps global system, as it were. And what Rena's work does is speaks to borders and movements and migrations that are happening as we speak, that are fraught, that are perilous, dangerous, and they continue. And I think both works then speak to the question of, is it possible to transgress these systems that are in place that prevent, deny, and quite often erase identity?
Before I turn to Juliet, I should say that for those of you who have not been in our atrium to see Bushra Khalili's The Mapping Project, which documents 8 different migrations, primarily from the Middle East or West Asia. And by documenting in the hand of the migrants, the refugees, she calls them travelers, the trajectory that they had to take, often crossing borders illegally, she remaps, if you will, a territory that we think we know by the invisible routes that are required for people to leave war-torn or economically distressed areas in order to get to safety and sanctuary. And in a way, Insecurities and the Mapping Project are bookends to an ongoing conversation about immigration and the refugee crisis. modern interiors would have been impossible for us as an exhibition a decade ago, at least an exhibition drawn from our collection. And one of the things that I think you have pioneered, or certainly made prominent, is not simply the collecting of important design objects, but actually collecting whole interiors. So I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the strategy of collecting interiors, because it blurs the border between design and architecture, and more importantly, how does one read an interior that has been extricated from its original environment? How do we locate that in the way we think about space?
It's not a new problem for curators addressing this kind of decontextualization of interiors in a gallery space, because in a sense you can't recreate the entire apartment or context from which it's been plucked. But in the Frankfurt kitchen, for example, that we acquired in 2009, we made an attempt to indicate the appropriate wall finishes of the adjacent spaces, and through contextualizing through film, photography, these other mediating forms, to give an indication of the overall planning, how it fits into larger urban structures and debates. But I think certainly that ability to bring disparate elements together in the context of an entire environment adds value to every one of the components, such as a wallpaper sample or fabric like a bedside quilt, which viewed independently might seem almost trivial or of so little importance. But when you understand the larger networks and factors that have fed into the design of that quilt, that wallpaper, and the kind of synergy that's involved in creating any one of these ephemeral configurations of materials, spaces, visual representations, I think it just becomes such a rich territory to explore, because all the works that you've been talking about, Sean, and in modern interiors are by their nature collaborative. They're intrinsically the result of collaboration of many different kinds of creative skills. And although we have celebrated some of the iconic furniture pieces which are in the exhibition over many decades, I think we're giving the collection a new twist. We're giving that narrative a new twist by really beginning to draw out, in particular, the contribution of many, many women who were professionally finding their feet in these 3 decades. You know, Greta Lohotsky, the first woman to qualify as an architect in her native Austria, and other perhaps less familiar names or totally anonymous names. So that's been part of a concerted effort, not just in architecture and design, but across the museum, to really find new ways of talking about women's art and creativity, and to enrich our collections in that way.
Thank you, Juliet. Let me turn now to all of you in case there are questions you would like to ask. Don't be shy. Yes, please.
I remember the Frankfurt kitchen very well, and I think there was grass on the floor and how many steps you could cut
Yes.
by using the kitchen correctly, you would save effort and time and all that. And I just wondered now, a couple of years have gone by, and as we all know, kitchens are getting to be the size of living rooms everywhere. Was there any noticeable reaction to how well that kitchen worked and how efficient it was and how you didn't need
There's-
that much more space?
Apart from the lack of refrigeration, I mean, these kitchens remained in use for decades and decades. You know, many of them are only now being removed from their original context. I think Greta Lehotsky herself said, you know, I'm not designing a kitchen for all time, but it was addressing very real needs and very different way of organizing a space for working women, you know, with a slow cooker built into each kitchen, for single housing for single women with these kitchens, as well as families. You know, these estates were around diversified housing, and she was thinking about everything that spun out from the kitchen, not just how we get in the utilities, these new clean fuels, but how the kitchen relates to the living room, relates to the schools, relates to the proximity to the transportation and workplaces. But that all had to be thought through collectively.
You must be a very good cook. I look at that kitchen and think, I couldn't do it. It's claustrophobic, and I just think it shows the differences in time. I'm not for huge kitchens, but I marvel that one could get so much in such a small space and then try to imagine what it would actually be like performing in that space. And so you must be a hyper-efficient cook.
It's not just the kitchens. I hope some of you are able to pick out photographs taken by Eileen Gray of the Paris apartment that she adapted for her partner Jean Badovizzi, which measures about 25 feet by 15 feet, and she's got everything in there. And again, looking at how compact the Maison du Brésil by Charlotte Perriand, you know, really thinking through multifunctional spaces. You know, what are the minimum requirements for an interior? Thinking back to basics.
Other questions? Please.
So it's for Juliet. First of all, I want to tell you how much I enjoyed the show, and you've done a phenomenal job in your own signature style. And I wanted to ask you how did you negotiate between the selection of the interiors, some of them very iconic and some of them are unknown private interiors, and using the collection, the museum collection, how, if you can illuminate a little bit about this process.
Well, we were working with the collection. That was our first parameter, but our collection is so deep and varied, and we've made these spectacular recent acquisitions, which we wanted to highlight. So it was a given that we would include Eileen Gray and Jean Badovizzi's E1027 house, and that we would include the students' study bedroom from the Maison du Brésil by Charlotte Perriand, working in collaboration with Lucio Costa and Le Corbusier. But it's also about researching our collections and finding the new new ways of connecting work that is already there. So I was very keen to give people a new look at someone like Frederick Kiesler, who is known through our recent exhibition for his Endless House project, focusing on an earlier period and his collaborative work with a whole network of American designers, not least the client, Margarita Mergentime, a very successful textile designer.
Sean, one of the things that struck me about your decision to include the UN IKEA shelter is that there are so many other shelters designed by architects for emergency situations and refugees that you didn't include, and that are in fact conspicuously absent even from the documentation in the exhibition. You want to talk about why that is?
That's a tricky question.
I have a reason for asking.
As well. Well, on one hand, the impetus for this exhibition beyond what's happening in the world now is that there are scores of architects in the world who are trying to respond to the multiple crises. And quite often I feel that contemporary architects use the word solution a bit too freely, in the sense that architecture is the solution to assist, aid, represent, help these populations. And the more I thought of it, the less convinced I was by architects proposing solutions. So I didn't want to propose any solutions. I only wanted to ask questions. And so the wall that has a matrix of fairly recent responses, specifically to refugee conditions, not natural disasters in many cases. They get fused quite often in discussions. I think they actually require very different responses. Are also global in response. So we have almost every, I think we have every continent represented, various conditions, contexts, etc. They are presented objectively, on my part, to ask the question, is there an efficacy? Is there an architecture that can resolve or respond to these crises in an effective manner? Of course, the IKEA shelter is presented for one to enter and to observe, but it is not necessarily the ultimate response. It is one of many, as you said.
I want to, behind my question was really to underscore a point that is largely difficult, if not impossible, for us to see. There is a massive humanitarian crisis that is occurring literally around the world. We tend to become sensitized to it episodically when it bubbles over into our space, when we see images of people drowning or boats being turned back by coast guards or lines of people not being permitted to cross borders, and then we forget about it again. And I think one of the issues that's certainly true with Insecurities and Bouchra's mapping project is to actually say, this is a huge crisis. It is affecting the world we live in. We may not see it, but it's actually affecting political decisions, distribution of goods, location of borders. In fact, even wars are implicated in this. And so to the degree that we foreground that by recognizing the idea that there are solutions for these displaced people that allow them to stay where they are is to further ignore the urgency of the problem.
Absolutely.
Political ad over.
I felt like, just briefly, I felt like architecture becomes a litmus of the very problem, and if we propose architecture as a solution, it ignores the problem. And it distances the very nature of what architecture and the design of an interior can be. And these are fundamental modern problems.
Yes, please. I was hoping to provoke a question.
In practical terms, how do you negotiate an immediate assistance with shelters? Do you negotiate with the governments, or how do you do it, your organization?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
You know, there is a disaster, but in practical terms, how do you help your organization? Do you negotiate with the government of that particular country, or how do you go about?
Well, in our case, if you're asking how do we deal with this, I think what we can do is to foreground the problem, to put it at least in the consciousness of those who engage with the Museum of Modern Art. And to do that through an exhibition that's visceral, that makes real some of these issues, to do it through public programs and an ongoing series of conversations, and to do it online through the conversations we can create through social platforms, social media and other platforms. But in reality, all of us have to connect with governments. The solutions to the situation operates both at a governmental level, which has its own bureaucracies and problems, but it also operates at a very granular level. If you think government is in control of those spaces, that's a very different story, even though those spaces are located in certain places because government has made decisions that that's where they'll be located. So there's a fundamental tension between the bureaucracy that regulates the location of refugees and the reality of what happens inside those camps. And all I can say is if you've never visited a camp, you should. There are enough of them around the world that they're not hard of access unless you want to go to the eastern edge of the Sahara. They are revelatory and deeply moving, and I think ultimately fundamentally disquieting experiences.
I mean, I would argue that I think it's incredibly important that this institution, we are not advocates, but we have a voice in the world, and that the visitors who come here can leave both of our exhibitions with an idea of not only what's happening right now, but that this is a historical problem that continues to be relayed, questioned, and then often ignored, as Glenn said. And that designers and architects can not only be involved, but they should be involved in a collaboration with the very governments that are quite often ignoring and displacing the very peoples that they locate or relocate. And I can think of examples in Australia where I've been, and in Jordan, where the camp in and of itself is a militarized zone, surrounded by razor wire with men with machine guns. Who are they protecting?
With a question like that, I think we'll take one last one, or rather with a response like that, we'll take one last one over here. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. This is for you, Sean, as well. Could you just said something interesting which I'd like to ask you to expand on. You said that you draw a distinction between refugee situations and natural disasters, and I wonder if you could explicate a little bit that distinction and how it affects the show, and if I can just kind of set up what might be the counter-argument. It would have to do with the fact that mass displacement is mass displacement and presents the same sets of problems once the people are displaced, right. That many war situations that produce refugees have ecological aspects to them, and conversely, many natural disasters, how they get filtered into their consequences are filtered through conflict and politics. You know, just look at Hurricane Katrina, for example.
Absolutely. I wanted to distinguish them within the context of the exhibition by arguing that architects like Shigeru Ban obviously have responded to both conditions and using similar materials. And the image that I included is one of his earliest examples in Rwanda. But to step back from a kind of the specificity of an event, of a natural disaster, is to argue also for how time and temporality, as Glenn has suggested, as Juliet has suggested, how time is not only built into these works of design and architecture, but how then people occupy that time or not, as the case may be. I can think of examples, for instance, in Sri Lanka, for instance, where with great gusto, architects and people were building shelters and villages for the displaced after the tsunami, and subsequently left them because they didn't function anymore in the way that they could or should, for instance. When we speak of the refugees and we speak of shelter in the context of displacement, I come back to the idea that on one hand, shelter is something that we make, that we invite, that we imagine. But when shelter is imposed on an individual, on a family, on a community, on a society, without question, and then the time involved in which those individuals have to reside in that space is indefinite, that's when the architecture changes. And that's when the meaning of architecture begins to either reinforce or negate the very ideas of humanitarianism.
I actually think there's an even deeper issue there. Natural disasters produce displacement, but generally the victims of those disasters are embraced by the communities around them, and people seek to find a way to accelerate their ability to get back on their feet, and they are often welcomed into whatever place they have been displaced. And so the space of those camps may use similar architecture, but the space is structured differently. Whereas in most of these refugee situations, you're talking about populations in locations where the communities around them don't want them there. And so you have a very different kind of organization, and those spaces are often located as far away from other spaces as they can be. So I think it's a really great question, and underneath it is actually probably an interesting study to try and really parse out the differences. I know there are other questions. I don't want to delay them. I saw one person, yes, right there. We'll take your question because you've been patient, and then we'll be around so you can ask afterwards.
The question is for Sean. You said you visited a lot of different camps and shelters, and I was wondering whether you visited some south of the border in this hemisphere, where informal architecture in favelas, like in Brazil or in Colombia, which has the third largest internal displacement problem in the world, and what you see in terms of differences between those that are organized and sponsored by governments versus those that are a lot more informal.
Right. Unfortunately, I haven't been to South America yet, but I will be going. But what I know of informal settlements, for lack of a better term, and the internally displaced in the megalopolises of South America and elsewhere, in India, in Nairobi with Kibera and Dhaaravi and in Mumbai. These spaces are almost condensations of people who are either forced or in some sense they go to them because there is no other choice. And they go to them and they, and I hate to generalize here, but they, in a way, start to self-construct a space for themselves. And I would argue that the informal settlements or slums of these cities are not just the cast-offs of those who couldn't survive elsewhere. It's a kind of shadow city that ends up being built out of necessity. And the refugee camps that are dotting the world now are, in one sense, shadow cities, but I think they are shadows of ourselves, and they are asking or demanding us to ask what we or who we see when we see the other.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Juliet. Thank you, all of you. Enjoy the day.